I spent last week walking around convention centres at Gamescom in Germany, where there are lots of games to play, but also quite a lot of enterprises trying to revolutionise the gaming industry with all of their technology. I've been a bit hesitant to that before, mainly because history has shown how fruitless that can be.
Before we get to the bit where I talk about how much I love motion controls, I'd like the official record to show that, generally speaking, I fucking hate motion controls. I hear all this support for them because they help to break down the barrier between player and video game to help usher in a wave of unparalleled immersion. And it's such bullshit because it implies that video games can't be immersive unless you're flailing your arm around like a lunatic. You're in trouble if you see the controller as an obstacle that has to be worked around. With that said, I'm sure you can make them work if you give it a bit of thought. Developers have certainly had enough practice through the years, and the law of averages says that they'll get it right sometimes. I've often preferred it when motion controls have been working in the background, so, like, Super Mario Galaxy had pointer controls and used motion controls like another button. But I think for a video like this, I should focus on games that put their focus on motion controls above everything else. Sometimes causes problems, most of the time it causes problems, but I think it's worth documenting the games that knew what they were doing. Because goddamn, that's in short supply. We should worship them as prophets. Making a good motion-controlled game isn't particularly difficult. All you gotta do is come up with a concept that doesn't work with a standard control scheme but comes alive when you approach it with motion controls. Like those precision tilt puzzles, enjoyable when you've got a near infinite spectrum of control, and some variant of terrible when you're screwing around with one of these weird plastic stick things. It becomes a lot easier if you give it a bit of thought, and this is what motion controls should do. They should act as a spark of inspiration to help make games that weren't viable before. Like dancing video games.
Okay, so Dance Dance Revolution has been out for a while now, but I feel like you'd be reaching if you described it as a dancing game. It's Guitar Hero that you play with your feet, to ridiculous levels if you were born in South Korea. I'm not really sure how this would work with motion controls. I feel like someone might end up dying.
The obvious temptation is to see the adverts and how Ubisoft present Just Dance at E3 and rule it out as this mass marketable cash cow that is churned out every year to maximize profits, and yeah, but does a repetitive release cycle translate to undercooked gameplay? Nah, these games do quite well for Ubisoft. Only Assassin's Creed games have sold more. And occasionally they work really nicely with the motion controls available on the 52 consoles they end up on. Never tried the Wii, but I think every game in the series has been released for the Wii, so I'm sure one of them is good. But I'm more interested in how the PlayStation Move and the Xbox Kinect handle things, and they do it quite well. When complete control of a character is entirely dependent on the reactions and, I guess, physical fitness of the pudgy guy waving his arms around, high-octane action games aren't really the way to go. Something like Just Dance, though, is a perfect fit, and as long as the tech can pick up your movements with a degree of accuracy, the controls become more representative of your input and it feels like you're actually doing a thing. I can't pick out one game in particular because there's so many of them and they're mostly the same game each time with different tracks. But when it works, it feels good. Helps if you have rhythm, though, and style and, grace. Guess you can't have it all. Fighting games with motion controls are really tricky. From the start, you're at odds over what a fighting stance looks like and how a lot of games have you bolt upright with both hands in front of your face to make it easier for the motion controls to process what you're doing. Like boxing if you had no idea how any part of that sport works. Almost like the old-timey boxing stance. It's beautiful. It's all in pursuit of realism, right? You want the controls to feel authentic, so you keep them simple enough for everyone to understand them, but I reckon that realism isn't the way to go. Not until the technology improves drastically. Until then, we've always got ARMS. That's not going anywhere. Rewind back to January of this year and the Nintendo Switch premiere in London, and apart from Breath of the Wild being new and shiny, ARMS was pretty much the most exciting game on display because it was responsive. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the event and approach it with sparkles in your eyes at the new technology, but it felt natural and arm movement affected your actions on screen as you'd expect, and that's all you can ask for. You punch to punch, you can't get more intuitive than that as long as it works as advertised. Even better, the controls work to a point where cutting corners won't necessarily help you. A flick of the wrist instead of a punching motion tends to produce unreliable results like your fist shanking off to the side. And I don't know if this was done deliberately to encourage players to play the game properly, but you end up with the kind of game that Nintendo were trying to make. Though after a day of playing it when it came out, I ended up pulling a muscle in my left arm, so it's apparently quite dangerous. If you get hurt in the game, it affects you in real life. Now we're immersing.
My only real complaint about how ARMS uses motion controls is kind of an occupational hazard. You can also use a controller and buttons rather than punching your TV screen, and it is more accurate. A lot was made about how the fact that ARMS has gotten into EVO and is the first motion-controlled game to be at EVO, but I bet you most of the players there use a controller. It's just a lot easier, and you're less likely to hurt your own arm in the process.
I've put it off long enough, but now is as good a time as any for me to talk about the Xbox Kinect and why I'd rather do many painful things than use it. For years, Microsoft rode a wave of self-righteous bullshit as they claimed to be revolutionizing the gaming industry by having their consumers dance around in front of an overpriced webcam and having some of their games work. Even when it did work, the games available never inspired me to get one, until quite recently when I realized that I'd like to talk about motion-controlled video games at some point. You've got this, at the very least, interesting concept for being able to control video games with your limbs, so why not use that? Not Just Dance again, I've already had my say on that. How about instead I talk about an indie puzzle platformer that came out last year and knew how to get the most out of the Kinect. It only took 6 years, but we got there. So we all know that Fru is genius, right? Oh wait, maybe not, because by this point in history, we've all grown very tired of the Xbox Kinect, and so Fru was released in 2016 with little to no fanfare. But despite those unfortunate circumstances, Fru still stands as one of the very few games that understood what made the Kinect a unique platform for video games. The silhouettes were always pretty reliable. Why don't we make a game around that? By standing in front of the Kinect, your silhouette is layered on top of the environment and creates platforms so you can get to the other side of the screen. Sometimes the overlay will cause platforms to disappear, or maybe you need to hold down switches to get something to activate, but everything you can do is understandable within what the game allows you to do. It's kind of like vertical twister combined with platforming, and it works really well. Was it so hard to make an inventive Kinect game? A tiny studio called Through Games managed it, and I can't even find out any more information about them because their name is so ill-suited for a Google search. What's everyone else's excuse? Why couldn't you do this?
In the time that I spent playing all the shovelware motion control games in the world, I've noticed that quite a lot of them are minigame collections, and I understand that. It's easy to imagine, but not necessarily easy to put into practice, easy to actually make this game. But that doesn't mean that you can't make them excellent.
So at this stage, I don't think many would need convincing that Wii Sports was one of the most important motion-controlled video games in history. It's one of the best-selling games of all time, mostly because it shipped with the Wii in a lot of areas, but it showed off the potential for motion controls to be used in competitive environments. Everyone was at least partially convinced by them. You put your whole arm into the swing when playing tennis. You stand up while playing golf, until you realize that you can achieve the same result by casually shaking the Wii remote from the comfort of your chair. It'll make you fitter, they said, but at the moment, all it's doing is making my wrist stronger. The one part of my body that doesn't need strengthening. But I guess this is why we have sequels, ladies and gentlemen. It's a shame that more games didn't use the Wii Motion Plus add-on that took the Wii's motion controls and made them really good. I mean it, Red Steel 2 was miles better than the first game. Skyward Sword did some fun things with directional sword swings, and Wii Sports Resort was way more fun than it had any right to be. You know, 2009 was a year that saw sequels for Uncharted and Modern Warfare, and yet I spent most of my time deeply immersed in this sports game. But why is it so good, RabbidLuigi? Why would you spend so much time on it? Such a simple thing, but with games like this, you have an idea of what you want to do. Say, I want to move my sword in this direction, and Wii Sports Resort fucking lets you do it. Obviously, not every game is as exciting as you'd like. I remember cycling being pretty boring and basketball was a little imprecise. But you bring along another player for sword fighting or table tennis, you can put curves on your shots, and it's basically as close as you can come to replicating that in a video game. Only 6 Wii games were built around Wii Motion Plus, which is a little disappointing, but even more so when you see what could be done with it. I like to think that this technology ended up being used elsewhere. If Nintendo end up making something like 1-2 Switch, but sports-based, give the game some structure. The world will thank you. There's one genre that benefits most of all from using motion controls, and that is shooter games. Technically, pointer controls count because the motion of your hand is affecting action on screen, and with this, you can blur the line between console and PC. The speed at which a control stick can move a cursor pales in comparison to what a mouse can do, but pointer controls do what they can to crank up the speed at which you can aim at a target. The vast majority of the time, giving a shooter game pointer controls improves it by a big margin. Like Resident Evil 4 on the Wii might just be the best version. But that's just one of the best games ever made. What about we put 3 absolute champions of first-person exploration on one disc and give them motion controls? I'd quite like that. Do that. If you haven't played them, I'd really recommend Nintendo's new Play Control remakes, where they took a bunch of successful games from the GameCube and re-released them on the Wii, but with widescreen support and motion controls. For some games, like Mario Tennis, this just made it like tennis from Wii Sports. But with Pikmin, it completely revolutionized how the game was played, allowing you to direct units much faster than you could before. The best of the bunch, though, was the pointer controls implemented in the first 2 Metroid Prime games, an addition that was spectacularly obvious given that the third game in the trilogy used them and showed how great they could be. I never really had any complaints over having to use a control stick to move around and shoot aliens in Prime and Prime 2, but by giving the player so much control in this department, you completely change how you perceive the world around you. Movement being this smooth streamlines nearly every part of the Prime games. In a way, it feels a bit more like a first-person shooter because the shooting feels a lot more incisive, but this also allows the other qualities to shine through. Controlling the camera while exploring these planets feels so much more satisfying, and there comes a point where you wonder how the game managed with a control stick doing all the heavy lifting instead. I personally consider Corruption to be the weakest game in the trilogy, but it still absolutely nailed the implementation of motion controls in a natural and rewarding manner. Copying this over to the other games is such an easy move, and putting all 3 of them together on one disc in the Metroid Prime trilogy is just perfect, really. The new Prime game should have gyroscopic aim, which is, as near as makes no difference, the same thing. That excites me greatly.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and when I look at how the pointer controls line up really efficiently with the Prime games as exploration games, it baffles me further when I consider that Other M had you hold the Wiimote on its side. I don't want to beat a dead horse into the ground any further than it has before, but I guess you can chalk that up to another bit of tone-deaf game design. Imagine if Prime 4 had a primarily third-person perspective and didn't allow some kind of motion controls. There would be much violence.
Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn to a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.